There we go.
Okay,
All right, it's recording.
great.
So thank you, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to give this talk. I gave Steve a list of topics that I had canned talks for, which was like 4 or 5 talks, and I had one that I didn't have a canned talk for, which was macro, and naturally he picked the one I didn't have a canned talk for. So over the last month, that forced me to actually put all my thoughts together into this presentation. And so I'll give it my best shot. I do want to say that while I do a lot of macro photography, it's sort of it's what I do when there's clouds in the sky or it's raining outside. It's one of those things I do when I really can't do the other types of photography that I really enjoy. Um, Typically, when I have spare time, I'm out shooting astrophotography at a local observatory in Westport, Connecticut. And at any time, if this club ever wants to hear a primer on how to how to do astrophotography, we can talk about that. Um, I don't advertise myself as a true macro guru. I know this when I went to the NECCC last or 2 years ago now, I guess. There was a guy giving a talk on macro who was just absolutely way over 5 nines over the curve in terms of his dedication to macro. Um, I do macro. I don't do it quite to that level of degree, but we'll go through the various pieces of it. We'll go through how I do it. I'll share a lot of images, and hopefully this can be a dialogue, and I can share with you, things that I've learned and I've been doing. And I do know that there's a bunch of folks on here who helped me on my journey here. Eli in particular gave a talk to our club in Stamford about 1.5 years ago. It wasn't specifically on macro, but it did help me with lighting techniques that I apply to macro. And now I use those techniques on a routine basis. So this introductory image is a katydid. I do like to shoot macros on insects a lot, which kind of bugs my wife. She can't stand insects, but I find them to be really interesting subjects for this. And there's a handful that I really enjoy, but are very hard to get. One in particular, which I've only done once, is a jumping spider because it has nice big bulbous eyes that make it look really cute. But if you like spiders, but I've only ever literally seen one once, and they're very, very small. They're only about 1 centimeter across. This little gentleman here was a much larger specimen. He's about maybe 2 inches across. And shooting him up close and personal was one of last year's COVID projects. And in fact, Sherry had some comments on this when she helped me with some of the ways this was finished. Let's see here. So here's what we're going to do for an outline. And by the way, Steve, how much time do I have tonight?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. You could go 8:30, 9 o'clock if you want.
I don't think we'll go quite to 9, but 90 minutes will be good. So I'm going to go through definitions of macro, the various setups and what you need to really get into this. We'll talk about dealing with different versions of depth of field. There's a technique using a telephoto lens that can be sort of a pseudo macro. We'll talk about focusing techniques with a single shot, focus stacking, and the like. I'll talk about background choices because if you have a choice, the background really matters when you're doing this kind of work due to the depth of field. We'll talk about some specialized tools. Eli was showing one earlier in the socializing segment, which was a focusing bellows. We'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about lighting for on camera, off camera, ring flashes, and other lighting sources. And that'll be the agenda for tonight. So let's continue. So this will just be a quick intro shot. This was a pocket watch of mine, which I decided to shoot just for this talk. This has a lot of fine detail in the arms, and you can see the fine detail across the face altogether, as well as some of the aging that's happened to the silver that's around the casing. I'm sure I could doll this up even further and really make the gold pop, but it really does. You don't look at a pocket watch this close all the time. And one thing I'm trying to get, a friend of mine is a jeweler, and he often gets Rolexes to fix. I want to get a Rolex from him with the case off the back and then shoot a macro shot of the movement inside, which I think would be really interesting. So definitions: an image where the size of the subject on the photographic plane, the film or the sensor, is life size or basically 1-to-1. That's what a macro is. The reproduction ratio is the ratio of the subject size to the sensor. And then, you know, there's a point at which macro changes over to microscopy, and that's typically when the reproduction ratio is greater than 10-to-1. So the absolute definition is a 1-to-1 mapping of the image on the sensor, so it's life size. But stuff that's up to 10-to-1 can still really be in that category of close-up photography. These are just a few different close-ups that I've done over the past, I don't know, a couple of years. That starfish I thought was kind of an interesting shot. I had to get a tripod up in a local pet store, and I'm friends with the owner, and he let me go in there, and he lets me go in there and shoot the reptiles and such. And some of them have turned out to be award-winning shots, actually. But even something as simple as pocket change can do it. You could get some really nice images if you dig in and do this technique. So all of those shots were shot in macro mode. They were all shot at 1-to-1. Now, depending on how far back you are, that'll make the image slightly different. The shot of the lizard's head was shot at a much larger distance than the coins. The coins were shot probably at about 5 or 6 centimeters. The starfish was maybe about 10 centimeters, and the lizard was shot a little further back, but not too much further back, probably about 6 centimeters. So why macro photography? You know, well, basically, from my perspective, excuse me, it's kind of another world. It's kind of right under your nose. You know, in my artist statement, I talk about seeing things from other perspectives. Well, not many people take a minute to look closely at, you know, your pocket chain or the face of a watch, or even some of these animals. And when you do look at them, there's incredible detail that's possible with not a lot of extra work. And it makes for some very interesting images. And it's just, I find it very intriguing to see some of the things that are possible in this world. So what makes a successful image? Well, what makes any image successful? The 12 elements, trying to get decent lighting, good storytelling, dealing with the narrow focus volumes, I call them, because it's not really a plane anymore. It's really a small, very small slice or a volume. How you handle that depth of field and the lighting really matters, and that really contributes to images. If you shoot lighting head on, you'll lose all the contrast. This is one of Eli's lessons to me last year, which was shooting from the side, the lighting with the lighting at 90 degrees or so, and it really adds to contrast. And I should have known that from my astrophotography, because when you shoot the moon, the best shots of the moon are when the moon is not in the full phase, because the craters are illuminated and cast shadows. And the same thing applies for the very small items as well. You want those shadows to throw contrast into the image and really enhance what you're seeing. And it helps with the detail as well. Where are these images used? Well, for creative, illustrative, a lot of catalog work. You'd be surprised that many times catalogs use macro for small parts. When I started putting this lecture together, I started realizing just how many things on Amazon, for example, are macro shots that they put in there. And I'm a physician, as most of you know. A lot of scientific imaging and medical imaging in dermatology and a few other fields really rely on macro photography. If you're trying to diagnose whether a mole is cancerous or not, if you're not going to go to the trouble of doing a full biopsy, getting a macro image to examine the margins of the lesion is very, very helpful. So the setups for macro, And this is where you can go to the very easy to the very, very, very complex. And I'm somewhere in the middle. I don't go crazy like that guy at NECCC. I have a setup that's somewhere between the first image, which is just a simple tripod with a camera mounted and a stage. And I'm certainly not nearly as far gone as the image to the far right here with all these lights. I generally shoot with just a couple of lights. But one thing I will say is that macro has taught me that there's an awful lot of do-it-yourself in macro. And I think there's more around the lighting and around using diffusers and making your own lighting tools and diffusers than in any other kind of photography that I've personally done to date. And it's gotten me into a wood shop. I've actually made a stage setup with some goosenecks that I use now with lume cubes to illuminate different things. And I find that every time I go down to the basement and set up the macro stage, there's always something I've got to think about, like, do I want to do something differently? Do I need a different kind of stand or holder or light fixture? And I spend a lot of time thinking about that. And to somebody who tinkers a lot, that can be fun. If you're interested in just turning something on and shooting, macro may not necessarily be for you, because it does require some extra thought because of the size, scale, and the lighting requirements. So I just put in a couple of images of how some people put things together. You can see in the left image here, this gentleman put together what looks like a cut up plastic cup around a ring flash to diffuse the flash so you're not getting such harsh shadows on a close-up subject. I believe he's shooting a bug in that, and you don't want to have it real harsh lighting. And you'll see I'm not an expert at the lighting yet. I'm working on it and growing in my journey here. Sometimes the lighting's a little too harsh, but that's, always get to go back and learn. The image on the right is just a setup that was used by this same guy that shows how he had to sort of jury rig the clip for his camera to rig it so he could get down up close and personal. So for easy setups, you really don't need a whole lot more than some kind of simple stage, a tripod, and perhaps an off-camera flash. I use the term stage because in many instances, unless you're shooting outside, you really can control an awful lot of what you're doing by setting things up on a stage, if you will. And I actually do, work with a stage frequently that I just rig up on my kitchen table or on a folding table with some black foam core or some white foam core for the backgrounds to help. Sometimes I'll actually have flowers in the backgrounds, but it's all on the stage. So I can sit there and I can arrange it exactly as I want. And even with the bugs that I shoot, I'll tell you some secrets about what I do to shoot the bugs. I very seldom shoot them in the actual open nature, because frankly, they move too much. And I have to do a few tricks. Some of you may consider them cruel, but I did look this up, and what I do to the bugs doesn't kill them. It's not necessarily nice to them, but it just slows them down for a little while. So this is a very, very simple setup. It's a ring flash on a very small tripod and just shooting a coin. And you can start here. And frankly, starting here isn't such a bad thing to do. This is a simple setup that I use in the very beginning. And it doesn't require, more than $50, $60 for the mini tripod. And that's a very inexpensive ring flash. But that's the beginning, and sort of like getting addicted to, cocaine or methamphetamine. Your first taste is cheap and free, and then all of a sudden you find yourself diving deeper and deeper and deeper and spending and spending and spending. So be aware that it can be a little on the addictive side once you start getting decent results. So in terms of specialized lighting, there are all kinds of rigs you can get. There's ring flashes. This is a very inexpensive ring flash. I actually use this one. This is an LED that doubles as a constant lamp as well as a flash. It works with both my Nikon and my Olympus gear. And it comes with a bunch of diffusers and modifiers that let me hook it up to both systems pretty easily. And when you're up close and personal like this, the modifiers actually really do matter a great deal. Other things you can do, and I don't have a photograph of this, is shooting in a light box. I have a white light box. I've got 2 light boxes actually. Is there a question? Eli, did you have a question?
No.
So I do shoot with light in a light box where the whole thing is lit up from outside by some LEDs that I have. And the light box really gives a much softer illumination to the subjects. These goosenecks that you're seeing on the right-hand side are really helpful for macro, especially when you're trying to get lighting from different perspectives. And I actually made my own gooseneck tool, which I do have right here. And I think I have a picture of it later. Let me see if I can back up and share this. So this gadget here has a tripod, ball-headed tripod on it. I've got some goosenecks that have attached to the base. And the easier way to have done this would have been to spend $100 on a platypod, which has all the same hookups. I decided I got a little offended by paying $100 for a piece of metal. So I actually spent $100 building this instead. Well, maybe not quite $100, but I did spend
I
like.
know that feeling.
What's that?
I said, I know that feeling.
Well, I have a sense of pride in the fact that I made it and I can use it in many different settings, but it would have been a lot easier to drop the $100 on the pre-made base. Let's go. So one thing I like using for lighting, this is an image of the Lume Cube system. Now, this is a very small light source, and even though it does come with modifiers, there's pluses and minuses with using the Lume Cube system. Number one, on that last rig that I showed you, it does have the ability to mount to that rig, which is primarily why I built the rig, to use the Lume Cubes with it. But I've also found that even though I'm using it because they're so small, they're very bright. But I had to build modifiers to diffuse them even further because they are so bright, even though I could turn them, you can adjust their level up and down. What's really nice about them is they're always on, and you can modify them. And when I'm doing the bug shots, I do go up and down and modify the output on these things pretty well. They also do work as slaves to a standard flash setup, and you can arrange them in that fashion as well. So depth of field and focus. With macro lenses, due to the physics of the optics, the distance from the subject to the lens, in addition to the f-stop, it produces extremely low focal volumes, which is the zone in which the object stays in focus. If you're shooting a subject like mountains, your depth of field can almost be infinite depending on how far away the mountains are. If you're shooting something at 10 feet, your depth of field might be much shorter. And when you're shooting with macro, even when you pump up the aperture to sort of get a better depth of field, you're talking millimeters at best. And you find that even fractions of millimeters begin to matter when you're really up close and personal with some of these subjects. So this is a graphic that I found on the net. And by the way, I try very hard to not just take people's stuff. I put the references to where I found them on the talk. With an f4 lens at 105 millimeters, you get a depth of field at this setting at about 2 centimeters, whereby you change the f-stop a bit and you get a much larger, almost double the depth of field. But with macro, all of a sudden, it's a whole different ball game from when you're at a much greater distance. And this basically is trying to illustrate that, and I probably should have flipped these. This one should have been first. You get a much wider volume, or the plane of focus is in the center, but it's kind of a volume to my mind, because it's not just one, it tends to be in front and in back that does stay in focus. So you do need to pay very close attention to this as you're setting things up. So this is just an example of some differences here. The image on the left was shot at about 6 feet, and the depth of field is roughly 10 inches. The image on the right was shot at 2.5 inches, and that's my jumping spider, the only one I've ever gotten so far. And the depth of field there was roughly 1/10 of an inch, maybe less actually. And this was shot with a 60mm lens on an Olympus Micro Four Thirds. So you're dealing with very, very narrow depth of fields. And to shoot insects and get them completely in focus, that insect is about 1 centimeter, as I said. You've got to take a minimum of 10 shots to get the whole body. Otherwise, the eyes and the pincers may look nice and sharp, but the rest of the image will be as blurry as that rear petal is in that image. The image on the left, though, is an example of a pseudo macro, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So this is just some examples of some macro shots. This is a piece of jewelry. This was shot at a distance of maybe 4 inches with the 60mm lens. And I pumped up the f-stop to really try to keep the chain links in focus. Because believe it or not, when I had this same shot and I was shooting it down at f2.8, the links were not in focus. The only thing that was in focus on there was the writing. The December 5th was in focus, and the rest of it was not in focus. And that's just how sensitive they can be.
Is that your birth date, Steve? December 5th, 1776?
Well, Steve, now that you ask, I wasn't going to say so. That's a Phi Beta Kappa key, and that was my Phi Beta Kappa key in 1985 when I graduated from college.
All right, but what's the significance of 1776?
I believe, and I don't know all of the history of Phi Beta Kappa, but I'm going to guess that's when the Phi Beta Kappa became instantiated.
Okay, all right.
But no, it's not my birthday. This is another example of, so this example I'm showing is because these images are single shots. And this is a relatively flat object. This is the same pocket watch I shared earlier. But you'll notice that the link, the chain link that holds the fob chain to the watch, which was removed for this shot, is out of focus. And this whole thing is no wider than maybe 1 to 1.5 centimeters. And where that chain is falling, or the clasp or link is falling, just puts it roughly 1 centimeter out from the main plane of the watch. And at this setting, even at this low f-stop at f3.5, even that small distance sets it out of focus. You'll notice that the face on both cases is in sharp focus, but it is a flat object, and it was shot head on, which is something that we'll talk about as well, because the shooting angle matters a great deal in this. You will notice also it was shot with lighting from the side to get as much contrast as possible from the engraving. And I think this came out reasonably well, but I shot this explicitly for this talk to illustrate the issues with the depth of field. Here's another example of the depth of field. This is just a plain old wood screw. And this was shot with f4.5. Each of those threads is about 1 millimeter in distance. And you can see that you've got sharpness from the tip, 1, 2, 3, 3.5 millimeters or so, and everything else is blown out of focus. And that's at f4.5. But when you focus stack, and this is a focus stack with the same aperture, this is 15 images, and it's focus stacked in camera. All of a sudden now you got roughly 10 to 12 millimeters of, that's a 10, 1, 2, 3, roughly 10 in sharp focus. And what I never realized was that I thought screws were smooth, but that you can see there's a lot of milling detail that's visible in this. And again, it was shot with the lighting from the side. But this really is the difference between a focus stacked image and a standard image, one frame, and what's possible. And this is largely what you have to do in order to get insects and other very small objects into sharp focus. So here's an example of what I'm trying to talk about in terms of these focal planes. and how it tends to work. If these are the various focal planes, this is where the various images are in and out of focus. What happens with the focus stacking is that you have to shoot at each of these planes in order to put these images all together to make one composite image. And, as you saw back here in this image, only the first frame here would be in focus. You need to then shoot at where each of these lines is shown and have the focal plane move in each of these successive images. And that creates the focus stack. Here's another example of the focus stack. This is just a couple of coins. And you can see in this stack, I've put a bar in PowerPoint to sort of illustrate approximately where the focal plane is on the image, and it moves. And it moves intentionally, but when you put everything together and you stack it, you can see that all the coins, including the penny, are in sharp focus, whereby I'd say the center image in the array has focus of the beginning of the word quarter and into the beginning of the nickel. But, the Abe Lincoln is not in focus in that shot. But there's other shots like the one that's the upper right, which is in focus for Abe Lincoln. So the technique of focus stacking brings all those parts together in software and allows you to have one composite image. Now, it doesn't always do it perfectly, and we'll talk about focus stacking errors in a couple of minutes, because there are some focus stacking errors in this image. If I don't point them out, you might miss them, but they definitely are there.
Steve?
Yep.
How far is the subject from the first element of the lens?
Here, it's about 3 inches.
Okay.
So this is what you do in Photoshop when you want to use the photo stacking algorithms that are in the application. So what you do is you load the entire stack of images. In this case, it's about 9 images or 10 images. And you tell Photoshop that it's a focus stack. And what it does is it goes through each image and it tries to find the parts that are in focus, and it masks away the parts that are not. So what I'm illustrating in the 3 images here is this is one of the images from that last focus stack. This is what Photoshop did. It's image number 2 in the stack, and it masked away, all but the center section, and that center section is actually in focus, and it leaves off the rest. If you look down the stack on the right, you'll notice, what it picked and what it didn't pick. White reveals and black conceals. So there's only a handful of smaller parts in the back of the stack that were in focus that it thinks were in focus, and that's what it took. And this is sort of an illustrative way to think about how this technique works. If you tried, you could theoretically do this by hand, but I'm not sure I'd want to make all these masks myself.
Are you focusing, when you're doing the focus stack on this particular one, I think I know how you did it, but are you moving the camera, or are you moving the focus?
This one's moving the focus because my setup.
You're leaving the focal plane in one spot.
Sorry? No, I'm not keeping the focal plane. The focal plane is moving because the camera lens is actually, I'm changing the focus on the lens.
Right. Okay. So the film plane is still fixed.
The film plane is fixed. That's correct in this setup. And my personal setup, that's always going to be the case. I don't own a pair of bellows I don't own a set of bellows, and I don't move the entire camera. But I will talk about how you could do the same thing with that setup in just a minute. Okay, so I don't think I need to take everybody through Photoshop for this. I think the description I just gave is probably sufficient. I did have a demo set up, but I'm looking at the time. We can do a demo at the end if we'd like, and I'll come back to it later. So there are a variety of software packages that you can get for focus stacking that help you to bring everything together. Once you've gotten your technique down, and we're not done with this topic yet, You can use Photoshop as I've talked about. There is, I thought I grabbed that. Creative has I must have screwed up the URL. The URL for Adobe is wrong. It's Creative Cloud, there's no W in the word creative. There are other software packages that are available too for PC and for Mac. And the one that's I've heard of that's I don't use myself, but I know a lot of people who do, is called Helicon. And that is, I guess, more of a professional level. There's different license types that are out there for it, and they range in price. And this is one of the more well-known and popular focus stacking softwares. There's also the Zareen, and it goes not that expensive for the student version. And then built into Affinity Photos, which is a Photoshop wannabe, they have a focus stacking algorithm built into that as well. You know, Photoshop, if you buy the photographer's package, is $10 a month. And Affinity is $25 for life, I think. I don't think it's a subscription. But you can, the bottom line here is there's a lot of different options depending on your degree of confidence in using different software packages and also your platform. In-camera focus stacking is one I typically have been using lately. The Olympus system has this as a built-in feature inside the camera. So over here, this is my Olympus OMD. It's got a 60mm macro lens on it. And this particular lens talks to the camera in such a way that when I set it up properly, the camera will actually vary the focus on every image up to, and will stack everything in camera up to 15 frames. And generally 15 frames is usually enough for the bugs I've been doing and for some of the other things I've been doing. And you can also vary the distance that it moves the plane. So you got a setting for narrow, and it's got a setting for wide, which then gives you even further flexibility. Each shot takes between 5 and 20 seconds to combine. And when it's done, it saves both the individual images as well as the composited image as a JPEG. I wish it was a RAW, but it doesn't create a RAW, it only creates a JPEG. But it really streamlines the work needed to create some of these images tremendously. Instead of having to bring everything into Photoshop or Helicon, I can just have the entire thing done in about 20 seconds. And when it shoots in rapid succession. So it's shooting something on the order of 10 frames a second as it's doing this. So it does the focus and it moves it, and the whole shot is done in maybe a second to a second and a half, depending if I'm doing 10 or 15 frames. This is probably the easiest way to do focus stacking I've run into, because I had been doing it before I had the Olympus system when I was a Nikon shooter. And when I did it there, then you need to make all these changes manually. You need to change the focus manually or move the camera, as Eli was alluding to. And that's when you really need to get into different rigs. There's other gadgets you can get that actually will let you set stops on a ring around a focus ring, so you could move it a certain bit and keep that equal. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to get varying results as well. The nice thing on the Olympus system is that it does the varying of the focus plane homogeneously throughout the stack. And doing that by hand can be a bit of a challenge. You're basically got to shoot, refocus, shoot, refocus, shoot, refocus, shoot, refocus, or shoot, move the camera, which is effectively the same thing. And that can be kind of tedious. And we'll talk about that as well.
Steve, in the in-camera focus stacking,
yeah,
how does it know if you want it to stack the focus vertically or horizontally? How does it know?
Honestly, I can't answer that question. I don't know. I didn't write the algorithm, and I've never studied the algorithm.
It just does it on its own.
It does it on its own. And to be honest, it does a really good job. It's taken what used to take me, an hour in Photoshop, and it's brought it down to 20 seconds. So it's kind of hard to argue with it. And if I really want to go back to Photoshop, it'll still let me shoot the 99 images or more, and it will still vary the focus itself. I don't have to worry about that. It'll do that itself. And I'll get a good stack. It only focuses the 15 and does the stacking in camera for up to 15.
Steve,
Yeah.
there's another piece of software you didn't mention, but it's only for Nikon users. It's called Control My Nikon.
Oh, okay.
And that's what I use. And it works very well. You have control over the whole, all the parameters you need to control for shooting. You know, what each step will be, the size of the step, the time duration. You can control the aperture shutter and everything on the camera. And you can also, the interval between exposures.
Yep.
And I don't remember, it's either $39 or $59.
I'll put that in the talk. Thanks for that, Eli. It's let me just write that down real fast.
There's a lot, it's got a learning curve on it, I'll tell you that.
Nikon capture.
My wife will pick up in a sec.
Okay. But Eli, you know, you've done focus stacking in what I'll call the old days. You know, I'm not wrong about how long it takes to do this when you don't have an automatic system in place. It's very tedious, and frankly,
I've never done it without automatic.
Yeah,
and
I couldn't.
It's tedious as it is.
Yeah, I couldn't do this for my insects without the Olympus because I'd have to kill the insects, and I don't really want to kill them to do this work. I do release them when I'm done, although they're a little cooler when I'm done with them. So I want to talk about focus stacking errors. Now, I pointed out that it's not perfect. And if you look closely here, and I don't know if I can maybe I can zoom in on this a little bit, you can see that there are errors that have crept into the focus stack. And this is because, you know, it's not a perfect system. And this one, I think I ran through Photoshop. So these are Photoshop errors. But I do see the focus stacking errors also in the Olympus system as well. And sometimes they're halos, sometimes they're mismatches like there are here. You can clean those up in Photoshop if you'd like, but you know, it's not a free ride. Sometimes this stuff is not perfect. And that's kind of what I'm trying to point out here. Oops.
It has to do with the masking.
Yeah. Well, it's not just the masking, it's that
because there's a lot of optical translations that are being made.
That's right. The images, the size of the object on the sensor plane, when you only move the when the focus is changed, can vary the size of the actual image. And
that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, the focus stacking software has to scale the images slightly to make them all line up properly, and that can introduce errors in the image.
Correct.
And that happens both in camera as well as when I've done it in Photoshop.
That's why they have view cameras with tilt and shift lenses. Bellows.
Yep. So we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about backgrounds, because backgrounds really do matter a lot in this. At least I found they matter a lot. I like using complementary colors when I can. I really like using a dark or a black background when I can. That tends to yield very nice results, especially with colorful bugs. I like to separate the background from the subject. And again, the dark backgrounds tend to be helpful with that. And as you've seen, like when I'm showing images like this screw, that might have looked a lot different if it had been on a black background. Same thing with the pocket watch image from earlier as well. And you'll see later when I get into some of the bugs, I do try and shoot with a dark background on the bugs. Subject choices. Now this gets real interesting. So flower, you know, there's an incredible amount of detail that's possible just to bring out in something as simple as a feather or flowers or seashells. I've got a friend of mine who does macro shots of seashells who went off the deep end and got a rail and, you know, does all this by hand on his Nikon. And it wasn't Eli. and he's gotten some brilliant results of seashells. He lives in Florida, and he and his wife go out looking for, you know, spiral shells, and has gotten some beautiful results there. And the detail is tremendous. And you don't even think about it when you're even looking at a shell that's only an inch or an inch and a half long, that it's full of that kind of detail, and it's really, truly beautiful. But one thing I found that really matters is the subjects have to be still. And for the bug work that I do, that tends to be a problem because they have a mind of their own. And it turns out that shooting bugs with the stacking technique can be a significant challenge, not because the camera and the software is hard, it's because the damn things move. The trick I've learned and I read about was putting the bugs, capturing them, putting them in a Tupperware and putting them in the fridge overnight. They tend to, and the reason the fridge is because it doesn't drop below freezing. That's to 36 at best. And the bugs actually survive that because it happens in nature. So it's not uncommon for an autumn day to drop into the 30s and the bugs survive. So what I tend to do is put them in the refrigerator for several hours and bring them back. I only get a short window of shooting before they wake up and fly away. I've shot some house flies in the last year, and I ended up, the most time I got with the house fly was about 10 minutes. And then he got warmed up and flew away. And note to self, if you're shooting things like house flies, which tend to be pretty annoying, shoot them outdoors, not indoors. Because when they wake up, they'll buzz inside your house. And if you've got a wife who doesn't like bugs, that could create other problems. I do
Ever think of a piece of dry ice?
Not too cold, Eli. Dry ice is way too cold.
No, I mean, but if you have it in an open environment.
I haven't tried that. It's an interesting idea.
It might just be enough to keep it down in that 36 to 40 degree range so that they stay still for a little bit longer.
Well, I know how to work with these guys now after shooting them for the last 2 years. After you're done shooting a bug for about 10 minutes, you're ready for it to fly away.
You're waiting for them to fly away.
Yeah. So other tips, you really want some high contrasty subjects. Bright subjects tend to work well. And when you illuminate them from the side, you can get more contrast. You want stuff that's still, things that are of high detail are great, and things that are primed for shallow depth of field matter. And then your shooting technique, whether it's a single shot or a focus stack, and there's times for both. I'm going to take you through some shots I've done to give it some examples. And some of these are, well, you'll see what I've done here. So if you don't like bugs, you might not want to watch some of the next ones because they're going to be a lot of bugs. This is a beetle from my garden. He didn't look so good on just a plain black background. I put him on a hydrangea flower, and I like the brown and the purple and how they complement each other. And I did get some good detail. What might have made this image better is if the one petal wasn't in the way where it landed, and if I had a better diffuser on it, because there's a hot spot on his carapace. And I do have that issue in several of the shots. This guy showed in the beginning of the talk. That actually is a black background, but it was illuminated and it looks gray now. But it was not a white. It was not a white foam core. It was a black foam core. But I had the lume cube illuminating the back, so I wanted a little bit more. I just didn't want full black on this because the flower's center is so dark. So I tried to get a little bit of contrast there. This one was a real trip to get. This little spider, which is called an orchid spider, was sitting on my door to the house, to the front of the house. And I shot in position. He was sitting very, very, very still. He wasn't moving. He was a wonderful, not patient, subject. And I shot him a whole slew of times, and I was able to even get some of the webbing to get illuminated, which came out. It would have been nice if it was even more illuminated, but it still made a nice image. And as you can see, because of the focus stacking on this, and this was a focus stacked image, I was really able to get the detail all the way across his body. And this guy was probably all in, we'll call it 4 to 5 centimeters across. He wasn't not a small subject. So this was a good example of how you can vary the in-camera stacking. This was with a wide setting on that stacking parameter.
It's a big spider, 1.5 inches.
Yeah, he was 1.5 inches, easily. This was one I've actually shown in competition and gotten varying feedback on. This one is called Buzz, and I was shooting dandelions in the basement during COVID, and then I was able to capture a housefly, stuck him in the fridge, came back the next day. I just sat him on the dandelion, and he stayed there for a good enough time to get a number of enough frames on him to get a decent a number of shots on him. And I kind of like this shot. I like all the detail in the dandelion tufts. The feedback on the image, though, is that the background with the dandelion tufts is just too busy, and it's really why this hasn't scored better in competition. This is actually from an echinacea flower, just the center portion of the echinacea flower, and I love the detail that's possible here when you look at the pollen on the outer portions of this, and you can see some pollen that's just fallen off, and the detail is just really, in my mind, you look at it, you never get this close and take a very close look at this kind of flower, and yet there's incredible detail here. So now we'll switch gears and we'll talk to the DIY aspects of this part of photography. I can't tell you how many times, as I said in the beginning, how many times I've built something here or spent on this. I've gone and bought every little gadget I can think of, short of the motorized system, which is, we'll get to that in a few minutes, but different lighting rigs and so forth. You need to be creative here because a lot of the off-the-shelf stuff is frankly insufficient to get the kind of soft lighting and the wraparound lighting that you want. You've got to get creative, and it stretched my imagination on how to do some of this. I had a picture of this, I'd forgotten. So this is my rig, and this was basically built in a small wood shop. It's not all that well finished, but it's very functional. This really gives me a lot of flexibility with where I put my lights, and I can put some diffusers in front of these lights as well. And it's perfect sized for the Olympus system, which is a smaller micro 4/3 format. Although the Nikon can fit on here as well, I've more or less given up on the Nikon system just from a weight perspective. And also the Olympus has a whole lot more built-in software than the Nikons do at this point. And it does require that you have a stage in front of you that you're shooting on putting your subjects right where you want them. I could take the camera off of this rig, but the rig provides a stable footing so that when I'm shooting 15 or more frames at a time, the camera stays completely still, and all I'm worrying about is the focus on the system, and that's quite helpful. Other rigs actually move the camera, and I'll show you some of that just in the next slide. So another approach to macro, if you don't have if you don't want to go and invest in a true macro lens, lenses are expensive. The macro lens I showed you there on my Olympus was, geez, I think it was $500, and on the Nikon it was $1,000. But you can shoot macro for $5. So what I'm showing here, this is a reversing ring, and what this does is that ring attaches to the mount on the camera, and these are available for Nikon or Canon, and in this case is Olympus or micro 4/3. And what it does is it fits into the filter screw threads on your lens, and then you can use, in this case, this is a zoom lens. You can use your zoom to actually vary the distance, because that's moving the lens elements. And literally, this was $5. it was literally a $5 purchase, and you know, you get really nice results. Now, focus stacking with this rig, you must have a thoughtful system of how you move the camera. Moving the focal plane with this rig is actually quite challenging because it varies a great deal when you move the zoom ring. The focus ring doesn't really do a whole lot in this case. You really need to focus with the zoom ring when you have the camera lens reversed. The other thing is that all of your aperture settings and so forth are now switched to manual. And on some cameras, I don't remember if Nikon does this or not, but when the camera lens is not on the camera, sometimes without having a pin set, the lens goes to f/22, and you can't vary that. That's not the case on this one on the Olympus, but I do know that if you were to try and shoot with a reversing ring on that system, you'd be stuck at f/22, and you wouldn't have it. There wouldn't be much you could do about that if that particular slide ring wasn't activated. That's only on some lenses, some of the older manual lenses. Some
I
of
know
the
on the Nikon lenses, anything prior to the G series, you can adjust the aperture.
So the next inexpensive way to get into macro, which is a little bit more expensive than the $5 ring, are the use of extension tubes. These tend to be hollow tubes that just change the distance from the lens's elements to the sensor or the film, and it allows for decreasing the minimal focus distance, which is where your subject can be set up and be in focus. And they're stackable, so you can actually have 1, 2, or 3 of these, and it will vary, you know, how close you can get to the subject, and sometimes that matters. I've got a set of focal rings for my Nikon. I've got a set of focal rings for my Olympus. Honestly, though, I don't tend to use them because, again, with the in camera these days, it makes it. I'm kind of spoiled, to be totally frank. But this system actually would work with the focus stacking in the Olympus or in the Nikon, for that matter, if you could do it with Nikon, because these actually have the pins that allow the electronics in the camera back to talk to the camera's lens. And as a result, you do get full functionality if you buy extension rings that have these connections. They vary in price. They can be as inexpensive as $50. I've seen them as high as $250, depending on the manufacturer and for what base you're working on, whether it's Nikon, Canon, Sony, or other. They work just fine, to be totally frank. But you will deal with that depth of field issue with these. Also, they have another issue, which is they change the amount of light that gets to the sensor. So you do lose 1 or more stops when you shoot with these rings, these tubes. They also can affect vignetting. Sometimes they'll affect a rather sizable vignette into the frame, depending on how many of these you use. So there are some calculations you can do to figure out what the magnification is from a given set of rings. I pulled this off of an article on Shutter Muse. Frankly, I never get this technical, although you can. So I have this to illustrate that you can get technical if you'd like. Eli shared another inexpensive tool. I don't know how much his was, but this is the bellows. And what this does is you attach your lens to the bellows, and the bellows can open and close. And it's sort of like using a variable set of extension tubes. I've seen these as inexpensive as $39. I've seen them as high as a couple of hundred, depending on the manufacturer and depending on the camera make it's for. But you can, these are not that difficult to use. You do need to keep everything isolated when you're using this. Other focus stacking tools are some rigs like this. This is a manual rail system. This gives you some very precise measurements, but this allows you to move the camera. So when you're using the reversing ring, this is the kind of rig I would tend to use because it's much more, as I said, it's very hard to change the focus on the on the reversing ring setup, it's much easier to just move the whole camera using a rig like this. And it's also very precise. You can move it millimeter at a time to get your stacks created well. It is, though, as many of these techniques are, it's prone to human error, because you do need to go shot, focus, shot, focus, shot, focus. And that does leave room for you to either forget something or miss a shot, and that could be problematic. This is sort of the granddaddy of where to go when you really go off the deep end. This is a focus stacking computerized rig. This also moves the camera, and this is about a $600 investment. It uses a USB connection to a computer, and you can vary, actually this will even handle setting off the shutter release in the camera as well. So it handles basically the whole thing. It's sort of a Ron Popeil where you set it and forget it. But if you really want to go to this expense, you're more into macro than I am. The only guy I've ever met who has a rig like this was that guy who spoke at NECCC a few years ago. Although I'll tell you, this probably does an incredibly nice job because the increments can be very small, and it's highly well controlled. So I could go into the manual workflow in Photoshop and give a quick. So here's what we do in Photoshop. You take a stack of images, and in Lightroom, if you do it in Lightroom, you basically load them as a stack. And then once they're loaded as a stack, you then invoke the auto blend command, which I believe is under edit. And auto blend will go through the stack and calculate what's in focus and what's not, and create masks for each image. It also will if you'll notice these images, this was shot by hand. So you'll notice that the images are, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but there's borders here and they're not the same. So Photoshop also goes through and aligns each of the images in the stack and makes sure that they line up as well as can be expected. And then it goes through and makes these calculations, and then it renders automatically the merged focus stacked image, which is what is in focus here. And you're seeing the head of this ball python in pretty sharp image. If I showed any one of those images without the stack, only the very slightest bit of him would have been in focus. What did I do here? I added some clarity here. Okay. Caveats. So when you're shooting macro and you shoot on nice black backgrounds, you got to make sure your backgrounds are clean. This seems like a no-brainer. I was shooting these in preparation for this talk, and I didn't actually look to see if the background was clean until I brought them in. And I realized, wow, there was lint all over the black material that I was using. The other problem with shooting on things like material and macro is that you can see here in the background, you can see the weave of the material, and that may or may not be desirable. You need to go over potentially, clean this up later, which is more work than you really need. And it would have been very easy to run a hand vac over this piece of material just to get rid of the lint. Every little thing will show up in a macro image, and I really mean every little thing. Use the bokeh to your advantage. In this case, I was shooting on that same material, but I set these rocks up in such a way that because of the bokeh and the focal planes, the rocks in focus, but the same material that was shot in the previous image, you can't see the weave anymore. It blurred everything out, and that was done by lifting the rocks on a small stage and shooting into the background and separating the background from the subjects by just a few inches. And thereby you don't need to worry about capturing the weave of your material. or in some cases, even the lint. I'm going to take you through just some shots that I've done at this point in the talk. And this is a lily beetle that attacks my daylilies every summer. I love his color. I can't stand that he keeps coming back, or his children's children keep coming back. And he's got a pretty grisly looking face, and they decimate my daylilies pretty much every summer. And I don't even know how to kill. I've tried everything to kill them, and they just keep coming back. But he made an interesting subject. This little guy, this little lightning bug, was one of my guests in my refrigerator for an overnight. He sat on a hydrangea plant that was set up on a stage, and I kind of like this image. And I don't think it's competitive necessarily, but it does show some of the nice detail of the segmentation of its body, of the segmentation in its antenna. And had I been more patient, I probably could have gotten them lighting up, which might have been kind of cool. This is that same jumping spider. I used him for an afternoon. You know, I love the fact he's got these nice big bulbous eyes, and he's so small that shooting him in a stack situation was pretty easy. Hard part for him was he didn't like to stay still even when he was cold. So there's a lot of detail on him in the fur, in his legs, and in his pincers. I find these to be really nice. We'll see. I just noticed there is a little bit of lint on this background. This is a piece of black plastic, and it's in a couple of places which I didn't clean up and probably need to. This was a summer cicada that landed at the end of its life. It hadn't. It landed on literally on my doorstep, my front stoop, and I grabbed him. And I think what happened to him was I think he got caught in a spider's web and was unable to fly. And I think it's why he ended up on his side on my deck. He wasn't dead, but you can see on his wings there's spider's webbing that is not part of his natural attire. It's also on his face. So I think what happened to him was he escaped the spider's web, and he must have exhausted himself, and therefore he became one of my subjects for an afternoon. He didn't need to go in the fridge. He was just not moving, but he definitely wasn't dead because he eventually flew away. Another view of the same cicada. This is an interesting little piece because this was another lesson about shooting indoors. So this is a tomato worm. And I don't know how many of you raise tomatoes, but you find them occasionally in your gardens. They're huge. They're about 5 or 6 centimeters. And there's a kind of wasp that lays its eggs on this particular caterpillar. And this one was right out of my garden from last summer. And you'll notice that there are some holes in some of the eggs. Well, as I was shooting this, the wasp babies started hatching in my house. And a couple of the babies kind of flew away inside. I was not shooting in outdoors like I should have been. And my wife just left the room, so she doesn't know that the wasps got out in the house, but they were babies. So I don't think they were much of a problem. But what I love about this shot is look at the detail in the insect's skin. You can see this marking, which look like little eyes, which is part of its camouflage. And you can see the details in the silk from the eggs that have been laid from the wasp. It's remarkable. And the lid of one of the hatched eggs is right there. And if you look in here, I think there might even be a hatching wasp visible. Or there's a pincer coming out right here, or a leg. So it's not for everybody, but it is kind of neat. Another different cicada. Now, this one could be criticized, I suppose, because of the harsh light. But in some ways, the contrasty light makes it kind of neat. This was a housefly. This guy just landed on a lily, and he must have been exhausted. He wasn't dead. And I was able to get him, and you can see the detail in its eyes, which I think, again, is really remarkable. This one did not spend the night in the fridge. He just sat down and wasn't moving. Maybe he was dead. I don't know. But again, you can see all kinds of detail. You see the hairs in its back and all over its body. And other than swatting them, I'm not sure people actually spend any time looking at them. And by the time they're swatted, they're not much to look at. This is my son's leopard gecko. And what I love about this shot is if you look in its eyes, this was named Rosalinda. I don't know why he named it Rosalinda, but you can see inside its eyes, there's an incredible network of colors and of veins that make up its iris, and how it opens and closes its eyes vertically, the iris in its eye rather. And I think it's phenomenal that you can capture something like this with an off-the-shelf camera. This wasn't done with anything special. This is a protea flower that has an insane amount of detail inside of the little the petal. They're not really petals; they're kind of stamen or pistils. I'm not sure which, but you can see all this level of detail. This was a focus stack from a Christmas arrangement a friend of mine got, and I thought this flower was just so neat. I went back the next day on Boxing Day, and they let me sit there and shoot it in a more precise way. And this is the requisite rosebud, and just some other flowers, and you can see all the pollen. And I personally find it just really interesting, the amount of detail that's just possible when you look at these things like this. This little guy was recently passed away. He was my son's pet. He went to college. He lasted another 18 months. This was his name was Greenpeace. And again, you can see in his eyes the phenomenal amount of detail that just, at a normal rate, in normal distance, you wouldn't notice. Greenpeace was only about 4 centimeters across, a tiny little frog, and just a gorgeous specimen. Another shot of Greenpeace. This one was focus stacked. He tended to sit still, but when he doesn't sit still, and I had to fix this, was when he breathes, this part of his chin expands and contracts. So I had to fix that in post because it was kind of fuzzy. It wasn't sharp. And just some beetles. These are single images. This is not stacked, but you can get some decent detail here. And that's the extent of my prepared slides, actually. So we can open it up for questions. I will claim that I'm good at macro. I won't claim that I'm a complete expert at it. I'm still learning on my journey, but I'll take as many questions as you may have. And thanks for listening.
Thank you, Steve. That was a great presentation. So everybody can unmute themselves, and if you have any questions for Steve, we can do that.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
When you're doing the different photos in the increments, does it have to be exact increments?
So the answer is it depends. It ought to be. You really want to vary either the focus or the camera's distance to the subject at fixed intervals to get the best results in the stacking software. So it does matter, and it ought to be at a fixed interval. That's why I say an automatic thing like what I have in the Olympus system is great, because I don't need to worry about millimeter changes in focus or distance. It's all pre-programmed, and I basically set what I want, and it takes care of it. It spoils you, though, to be frank. I should take more care and use some of the rigs, especially the if I really got into it, that expensive $600 rig would be where I would go next for my own shooting. If I were to really, it'll take a while. I spend more of my money on my telescope gear than I do on this. It's frankly, Astro's got its own challenges, but I kind of I'm probably not going to go to the trouble of buying that $600 rig.
Steve, so if you were using, say, your Nikon or another camera other than the Olympus, and if you were just moving your focus point, you could just like move it at single intervals as
Yeah.
it's.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm going to see if I can do a quick Google search. There's a gadget I've seen at B&H, and if I can find it really quickly, I'll put this thing on the screen. Where you have a rig which sits on the actual lens, and what it allows you to do is physically put pins in the gadget, and then you change the focus according to where the pins sit, and you can then get a fixed change to the focal point by using this guide that sits on the front of the lens. I don't have an image of it. I couldn't find it quickly, but I have seen it on B&H. It's surprisingly expensive, actually. It's not like a $10 or $15 rig. It sits on the lens and has two parts. One will rotate and one will stay fixed, and the fixed one has places to put these pins, which then allow you to vary your focus by as much or as little as you want. What people tend to use that rig for mostly, though, is for zoom work when they're using movies. They'll have I don't know if you've seen this in TV or movies, sometimes they'll have a focal point on a subject that's close, then the next person will talk who's in the background, they'll zoom the focus back to the next person, and then they zoom back, and that's performed so accurately because they'll have a rig like that which allows you to change and then change exactly back to where you were based on this little rig. But you could use the same thing for focus stacking. You just need a lot of pins.
Any idea what that's called?
You know, as we're talking, I'm gonna go back to B&H so I can find it real fast. I'm not finding it so fast. It was this gadget, which was a ring. Oh, I found it. Hold on. We'll share the screen. So you see this rig? So you could put,
Yeah.
you put stops on this ring on the outside, and then you turn until the pin lines up where your stop is, and that gives you fixed amounts of focus. And that's how that'll work with zooming or with focus.
Hmm.
And as I said, it's surprisingly expensive for what it is. It's not that sophisticated. Other questions? Maybe I should grab this for a future, add this to the talk.
That a universal for any lens? Or is it
I think this one,
manufacturer?
I think this one is a universal, actually. On virtually any DSLR lens, yep.
I have a quick question. Do you use filters at all on any of your macro work?
So you mean like, what kind
Like
of?
polarizer or?
Yeah, I actually do. I do use a polarizer from time to time because sometimes it cuts down on the glare. I have not perfected some of the lighting to get the real soft, bright light on my subjects. So the polarizer actually does help cut down on the glare, especially on the shiny insects, actually.
Thank you.
It doesn't cut it down completely, but it does help. Other modifiers I tend to put on the light sources than on the camera.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I like the goosenecks for having some off-camera flashes out off to the side there. That kind of looked neat. And I like the idea of catching insects and putting them in the refrigerator for a while, and then photographing them. That's a neat technique. I wish I knew this earlier though. Cliff Foley has a macro photography print competition this Friday, so too late for me for now. But next
I
time.
didn't know that was going on. I would have entered.
You a member of his club?
What club is that? No.
Mid Hudson Photo Club. It's just a photo club. But,
Guys, since I joined DRPP, I'm now a member of like 5 photo clubs.
I know, I know.
And any given week, there's a photography talk by one of these clubs, by Stanford, by Ground
Yep.
Glass,
Yep.
by you guys, by DRPP. I've just become, and then I've got my one talk a month from the observatory. That one was last night.
Mhm.
My club's the Stanford club's giving a talk on Ansel Adams tonight, which I'm missing to give this talk. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's been I've given you something to think about. And if you haven't done macro, give it a crack. For the $5 it takes or $6 to get a reversing ring, it's super cheap to even give it an early go. And if you like what you get, you know, the sky's the limit. You can spend your way into the next century on this gear.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of good info. Thanks, Steve.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve.
Good program, Steve.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.
Take care, everybody.